Welcome to Principles of Ecology, How Ecosystems Work. This is Lecture 4 of the Introduction to Environmental Science. What we have just completed is the first unit, 3 chapters. This unit has 4 chapters in it, and we'll get into more in that. The information is available currently in the content section of the course homepage. You should be able to see it there. So, how ecosystems work. It's kind of a microcosm of an ecosystem. See that little guy there? It's a frog, yes, actually. And that's an African violet, trying to root an African violet. He hopped in our kitchen window early one morning, and I got his picture. So, here's what we're talking about. Let's look at humans and nature, the vital connection. Agriculture, one central part of human ecology. Artificial selection is another part of human ecology, central to us. Ecology is actually the study of natural systems. That's what we're talking about here today. Very complex roots. We'll go through those as well. Talking about ecosystem function, how these things actually work. The flow of energy and nutrients through these things called food webs, which are kind of complex. We have a solar-powered biosphere, and you will see those 3 letters, P-A-R. I'll define those later. I'll just save that. You have something to look forward to now. Yay! Nutrient cycles, also known as biogeochemical cycles, biological, geological, and chemical cycles. We're going to look closely at carbon, how it cycles, nitrogen, a very important part of our ecosystem, and phosphorus. Finally, talk about biomass and ecological pyramids. So next, some connections in nature for us. First of all, humans are a part of nature. It may not look like it. Maybe you can't really tell what that is. It's actually a picture taken from the International Space Station. But when I draw this outline on it, you can kind of pick out some features. So we are a part of nature. Certainly we're a part of nature. This is a nighttime shot of, you might have gathered, a familiar place during the day to us, the Florida Peninsula. And what I've circled down here in the lower right hand corner is actually Miami, the lower east coast. Look at the whole thing together, and there's a lot of things going on in that picture. First of all, there's Tampa. You probably could have picked that out on the west coast. And everybody's favorite place, happiest place on earth? Yeah. Oh well, okay, it's Orlando. Right. Eventually, those 2 cities are going to grow together and be one big light. If you're trying to find Sebring on this picture, I don't know if it even shows up. To survive, just like all other species, we have to depend upon soil, yes, air, of course we breathe it, water, we drink it, those renewable resources, the sun, we have a solar-powered biosphere, we'll talk more about that in a bit, and a host of other living organisms to keep us alive. We'll talk about what types of organisms those are. Do we do things a bit differently? Well, than other organisms, there are things that we need. We need certain things. And if you're looking at this image here, you could guess that those bright yellow spots didn't just create themselves. We actually came up with the method of powering lights through electricity. And to connect us, because it's hard to drive on the sand without having roads. Those are things really that other populations of organisms don't need, but we do. So agriculture is a central part of human ecology. Artificial selection is a term that was actually coined by Charles Darwin. It describes the selective breeding of domesticated organisms that produce or maintain desirable traits. Like this little bitty thing over here on the left, that's actually a precursor to a much more familiar ear of corn over here on the right. Selective breeding over centuries, millennia maybe, I don't know how long it took, transformed this teosynite, there are very few fruit cases, what the kernels of corn are actually called, into modern day maize. Much rather eat that corn on the right than that little thing on the left. It's been practiced for millennia. Wheat, rice, dogs, very different from their ancestral forms. And quoting Abu Rayyan Baruni in the 11th century, I believe he was the Sultan of Brunei, I could be wrong, but anyway, the agriculturalist, and this is the 11th century, 900 years ago, selects his corn, letting grow as much as he requires, and tearing out the remainder. Why would he tear out the remainder? Because he doesn't want it to continue to grow. He doesn't want those seeds. He only takes the best. Most of the products we eat have been subject to some form or other of artificial selection. So, artificial selection, central part of our ecology. At least one local dairy farmer, Bishop Dairy, has no bulls on their farm, no male cattle, if you will. For cows to give milk, they must have recently given birth to calves. But remember, Bishop Dairy has no bulls. Bishop and many other dairies in the country use this thing called artificial insemination, or AI. There are many pros and cons to this, but it is a technique that allows the farmer to maintain a great deal of control over the animals, and it's gaining increasing acceptance. So what's next? We'll talk more about this in a later chapter, but genetic engineering, not just going from that the little bitty corn maze to the big one. Genetic engineering is the introduction or deletion of genes in domesticated organisms that are termed GMOs, or genetically modified organisms. GMOs, might want to pay attention to those quotes, can be defined as organisms, plants, animals, microorganisms, you get the picture, in which DNA, genetic material, deoxyribonucleic acid, if I ever ask you that question on a test, it'll say DNA, you won't spell out deoxyribonucleic acid because I can't spell. DNA has been altered in a way that does not occur naturally by mating and or natural recombination. That's a definition from the World Health Organization. That's what GMOs are. In this case, these are coho salmon being genetically bred to withstand different salinity levels. It's this tool called CRISPR-9 that's part of one of the assignments. The assignment for this lecture actually has to do with citrus and some genetically modifying of those organisms. But it is a tool that is used to actually go in and sequence genes and change the way the DNA in organisms works. Today, we have a lot of genetically modified organisms. They are very common. Soybeans, resistant to herbicides. Why would you want soybeans resistant to herbicides? Well, because now you can simply plant the beans out there in the fields and you can spray the entire field with Roundup and it won't kill the soybeans. It'll kill everything else. That's also leading to weeds that are resistant to herbicides, but that's a different story. Monsanto has actually patented most of the soybeans in the world that are resistant to these herbicides. Come on, next. There we go. I have corn that's resistant to insects. That would be a much probably more favorable thing, because then you wouldn't have to spray insecticide on the corn. You could simply let the corn grow and the insects won't eat it. I don't know how that works though. This example, these are coho salmon. They're engineered to be more adapted to seawater. We'll look at this in a later assignment, 1993. So, artificial selection and GMOs. So, this is a question. If we could produce a strain of citrus that is resistant to citrus greening, well, should be. Well, what's greening? Well, that's a good question. This is where greening has actually been found. It started out in South Florida. You can see where all the checkerboards are. Citrus greening is a disease that is simply destroying citrus fruit throughout Florida. It's moving north. It's definitely taken a major chunk out of the citrus industry. Greening is where an insect, a psyllid insect, introduces this virus into the citrus plant, and that virus goes into the roots and kills the roots. And so we've basically losing a lot of citrus. So there's the question. We'll see more of that in a bit. Some fundamentals of environmental science. Ecology is one of them. Study of interactions of organisms with their environments, more than one environment. So, you could put quotes on that one too. You may see that definition in the future. So, the term oikos, Greek for ecology, and this is a Greek guy, Theophorus, talk about a bit what he did. Ecology takes its domain, its area of study, domain, area of study, same thing, as the entire living world. Environment is a term referring to our surroundings. We'll get into much greater detail later in this unit. Environment is not synonymous with ecology. Ecology is that science, okay? You can save the environment, you can save the planet, but you can't save ecology. Ecology is a study, it's a form of study. You can't save ecology more than you can save physics or save chemistry. Ecology has complex roots, and Theophorus is a part of that. So, 250 BC, this guy, Theophorus, a friend of and successor to Aristotle, the Aristotle, wrote about the relations between organisms and the environment. 250 BC, 2,200 years ago, more than that. This gentleman, Carl Ludwig Willdenow, an early German plant geographer. Looking at this fellow here, he actually looks more learned because he's studying lakes. Lindemann is his name. R.A. Lindemann of Yale traced energy available relationships within lake communities. Hey, what gotta say. This learned gentleman here also studied lakes. G. Evelyn Hutchinson and several others took up this idea of energy flow and systems to found the development of systems ecology, a term that we will use in later chapters, later lectures, is the niche. And Hutchinson is the one who really formulated that based upon his work in lakes. And this fellow, of these, this list of roots, if you will, he's still around. He's still with us. Edward O. Wilson, one of the pioneers in life history classification, did some interesting things with bugs in the Florida Keys, killing a lot of them. All these scientists worked in divergent parts of the environment. That's where their study was. So, ecosystem function, classifying consumers, organisms occupy feeding or trophic levels. It's a nice picture of a pond there. Trophic, note the quotes. Any class of organisms that occupy the same position in a food chain as primary producers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and so on, or etc. if you want. The first trophic level, the bottom trophic level, the primary trophic level is illustrated by these trees here in this image, and if you can see the pond, there's plenty of algae in the pond. Primary producers, also known as autotrophs, or self-feeders. Now the simple way they do that is they take water and light, which is energy, and CO2. Have I said what CO2 is in the past? CO2, carbon dioxide. You will see that a lot. You might want to make a note that CO2 is carbon dioxide, and they make sugar. Well, we call it sugar, chemists call it sugar, but it's actually things like cellulose or whatever starch, any of those sorts of things are actually 6-carbon sugars, and it produces oxygen. Autotroph, self-feeder. So, primary producers, autotrophs, self-feeders. Plants are the most common types of autotrophs. Photosynthetic, they take the sun's light and synthesize sugars. Algae and aquatic systems. Photosynthetic autotrophs feed themselves by, and this is a term you'll see in other nutrients, fixing carbon. In other words, taking carbon in an unusable form, in this case carbon dioxide, and fixing it into something that we can use for energy, like a sugar. Taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, I guess I should wait for this to come up on the slide. Using sunlight as the energy source, talk about that in a bit. And in a very simple form, I've shown this once already, but we're going to show it again. 6 carbon dioxides plus water plus sunlight, you saw that sunlight come streaking in there from above, produces a sugar that the C6 is 6 carbons, 12 H that's 12 hydrogen atoms, 6 oxygens. That is a sugar molecule, a starch, cellulose, are all the same sort of thing. And it produces oxygen. So when you go in the forest, things just smell better because there's more oxygen in there for us to breathe. So, organisms occupying feeding or trophic levels. It's not just about autotrophs, because we're not autotrophs. Subsequent levels are occupied by heterotrophs or other feeders. Primary, these herbivores. Actually, that is a herbivore. That is a jellyfish. Secondary, the first level carnivores are these other sort of clownfish. I forget what kind of fish that is, but it eats jellyfish of all things. Tertiary, second level carnivores, they pretty much eat whatever they want to eat. That is actually a Siberian tiger. I took this picture also at Busch Gardens. I go to Busch Gardens a lot. Great pictures. And then there are these things called omnivores. Omnivores. Bears are your favorite omnivores. Well, actually bears don't make a Thanksgiving meal. That has your basic turkey, your basic vegetables, your basic probably things you shouldn't be eating every day. But we are also omnivores. We think of bears, but humans are omnivores as well. Then we have these things called detritivores. This happens to be a crab that cleans up the bottom, cleans up the dead things off the bottom. I could also have put a picture of a vulture on here. In this part of the world, in Florida, vultures are the primary detritivores. They eat most of the roadkill, if you will. It's just an example. And then you have these things called decomposers. Of course, these are mushrooms. And the mushrooms, the decomposers, take that organic matter and release the nutrients so the plants can grow again. Very simple idea of a food chain. Food chain is a series of organisms, each feeding on the preceding one. Food chains may be either the grazer or decomposer type. We're not going to get into that much detail about food chains at this point. Each organism is either a producer, a self-feeder, an autotroph, or a consumer, a heterotroph, other feeders. So you're either making the food or you're being eaten by somebody else who doesn't. Depending upon the primary feeding habits, consumers can be classified as herbivores, carnivores, or omnivores. I think I went through that in the previous slide. And this is a simple food chain, so let's look at this very carefully. Everything starts with solar energy and heat being released. So the first trophic level, the primary producers, the autotrophs, are the plants in this case. Plants, if they're eaten by a second trophic level consumer, is an herbivore. Things that only eat plants like that caterpillar there, and heat is released. Notice heat is being lost at all these stages. That will become important as we move through this particular lecture. And then you can guess what's going to happen next. That poor robin has to eat a caterpillar. I guess they like it. Gives off heat, so the secondary consumers are carnivores. They just eat meat. And then the fourth level, well, I'm sorry, let me back up. Some parts of that caterpillar end up being just dying and laying on the ground and being decomposed by detritus, decomposers and detritus feeders. Then we have the Cooper's hawk here at the top that will eat the robin. But once again, the robin dies, heat's released. Same way with the Cooper's hawk. It dies, heat's released. And then eventually these things break down those nutrients and return that back up to the plant. The plant can take that on. So that is really a very simple food chain. But let's look at something else. Food webs, far more complex ideas. This is a food web. We'll walk through this one right now. You might guess that at the bottom is plants, but this type of plant happens to be algae. Complex network of feeding interactions. Many organisms are involved in food webs, and this image does not do justice to a food web. There are 100 times more organisms involved in it, but this is very simplified, very simplified. Many food chains involved in a food web. I already said that, yes. Food web more accurately describes the feeding relationships in an ecosystem. So, starting with these phytoplankton here at the bottom, phytoplankton, algae, primary producers, they get consumed by the herbivorous zooplankton. Zooplankton are plankton, they are floating in the water, but they're animals and they are herbivores, they eat phytoplankton. And this stuff over here on the right, I know I wrote over the word, but those are krill. Best buddy movie ever. I'll tell you about that later. Anyway, so krill, they become important in a moment. Well, they're important all the time. The squid will eat a lot of different things. They will eat the small fish. They will eat some of the zooplankton. They'll eat a lot of different things, but they also get consumed by penguins, by leopard seals, elephant seals, sperm whales, all those things. Obviously, we have elephant seals eating leopard seals, so that's kind of that side of that food web. And then leopard seal eats a crab-eater seal, among other things. It gets eaten by killer whales, of course. And then the sperm whale it doesn't eat killer whales, but it will eat squid. The blue whale. The blue whale, you see I just highlighted the krill there. Blue whales, the largest animals ever to live on the earth, only eat krill. They are baleen whales. They only consume, these things are 100 feet long, or more than that, how long they are, huge, and they weigh 100,000 tons. They are just incredibly big. Largest animals, but they can only live in the ocean, and all they eat is this little microscopic thing called krill. And who's at the top of this food chain, food web? Well, human beings. Because we pretty much will eat, well, the whales at least, we used to do much more of that than we do now. Generally, the more complex a food web, the more stable it is. And stability is very, very important. You can recover from disturbance if you have a stable food web. Very healthy. I like that word, healthy, coming in there. So, flow of energy and nutrients through food webs. We'll see this picture in a little bigger form in a moment. But most terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems ultimately depend upon sunlight, photosynthesis driven by sunlight, by green plants for their energy. Food chains are biological avenues for that energy to flow and nutrients to cycle in the environment, kind of drive what goes on in the environment. Energy flows in one direction through food chains, but nutrients are recycled. I kind of showed that when we talked about the food chain itself. In this case, the sun comes down, you get all that sun striking the surface of this forest, 100%, but very, very small amounts of that sunlight actually ever make it to the forest floor or provide energy to the detritus and all those sorts of things that are going on down deep there. See how there is energy lost through evaporation, through plant respiration, and all those things. Nutrients are recycled through this system. Nutrients of the food chain re-enter the environment through the waste or that decomposition of dead organisms, for sure. Dead organisms. I spent a lot of time on this slide. I'm not sure exactly. We're making the point again. Anyway, get the idea. We have a solar-powered biosphere. That's sunshine. Light propagates through space as a wave. See that wave running along that top of that graph. So through space, and you can see that there's quite a bit of length to it. The shorter the wavelength, if you will, the closer those peaks are together, the more energy there is in a wave. The longer the wavelength, the more heat is generated by the wave, but less energy actually. A photon is a particle of light that bears energy. We won't go into the physics of that, just that it's important in terms of photosynthesis. Infrared, long wavelength, low energy, gives off heat. That's what we use to heat things. Basically, infrared IR interacts with matter, increasing the motion of that particular matter. When we heat something in a microwave, it's using this long wave radiation. UV, short wavelength, high energy radiation. UV is so high in energy, it can destroy biological machinery. PAR, that is what we're talking about, photosynthetically active radiation. I told you we'd get there. That is a very, very narrow band of this entire electromagnetic spectrum. Very narrow, but that is the part that we can actually see. That's the visible part of it, right there. PAR is between the two extremes of infrared and ultraviolet. Kind of a sweet spot. So we get energy flow in ecosystems. This is a larger version of that energy flow diagram. First of all, we're going to have the sun coming in, boom, right there. 100% of the sun striking the top of this forest. This is a boreal forest. Hits the top of it. Moving along through that, though, only 79% of it is actually absorbed by the canopy, by those canopy trees. About 10% of it gets bounced back off into the atmosphere, back into the sky of that incoming. Once again, we're just talking about photosynthetically active radiation, not the heat, not the other wavelengths. Plants in the middle layers absorb an additional 7%. Then you go down to the forest floor, the low vegetation takes another 2%, and then only about 2% of that sunlight, that photosynthetically active radiation shining on top of the canopy there, reaches that forest floor. Excuse me. So, let's look at photosynthetically active radiation, PAR. You might expect to see that again. Quantified as photon flux density. Let's not dwell on the physics of it right now. Photon flux density is the number of photons striking the square meter of surface each second. Drives photosynthesis. Chlorophyll, this is a type of structure in plants, absorbs light as photons, energy. Landscapes, water, organisms, all these things change the amount and quality of light that reach a particular area. The boreal forest before, 100% of the sun strikes the top of it, 2% makes it to the forest floor itself. There are 3 different pathways. We're only really going to look at one here just to get the idea of photosynthesis across. So, 3 different pathways. This is actually a generic leaf cross-section. You can see the stoma, that's where the gases come and go. There's some gases that come in and other gases that go out of a leaf. So, photosynthesis, greatly simplified. You've seen this a couple of times before also. 6 carbon dioxides, 6 waters, makes sugar and 6 oxygens. And that's how that carbon dioxide actually gets inside that leaf, is through that hole in that plant leaf, through that stoma. This is a kind of an overview of what is known as C3 photosynthesis. It's used by most plants and algae, very common. So, it takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, plus something that's already made, the plant's already made this 5-carbon sugar called ribulose bisphosphate, don't worry much about that, and makes a 3-carbon acid, actually 2 3-carbon acids, phosphoglyceric acid. Do the math, those come up to be a 6-carbon sugar in the end. To fix carbon, plants have to open their stomata and let in CO2 right through there, matter of fact. Now, one thing when they're letting in CO2, they're also letting out water vapor. Water gradient, we'll talk more about this in a later lecture, may allow that water to escape. Now, that's not a problem in Florida when it's raining like crazy, but in high sunlight conditions in the desert, you might want to avoid that. So let's get into some nutrient cycles, how nutrients cycle in the environment. Nutrient cycles. Nutrients move through the biosphere in biogeochemical cycles. Each cycle involves an environmental and an organismic phase. So the carbon cycle mostly is carbon is cycled through photosynthesis and cellular respiration. When I say respiration, every time you breathe out, you are actually breathing out carbon dioxide. You take in food and then you breathe in oxygen. That oxygen in your body goes through this thing called the Krebs cycle, and it breaks down that sugar into energy and carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is something that we exhale. It's an oxidative process that cycles carbon and oxygen in the biosphere. We affect the carbon cycle, well, just through breathing, but also when we cut down forests, because that reduces the amount of photosynthesis, and burning fossil fuels, oxidizing them essentially, turning them into carbon dioxide and energy and water. The nitrogen cycle. Atmospheric nitrogen is made available to plants by a variety of organisms that can fix nitrogen. We'll talk about what type and the conditions for that later. Modern farming practices are now interfering with this natural cycling of nitrogen. And the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus is primarily found in rocks. They're phosphorus-rich rocks that slowly release phosphates to soils and water. Quite often phosphorus is a limiting nutrient for plant growth. Artificial fertilizers replace phosphates lost to runoff. The practice often causes pollution problems in nearby aquatic systems. We will talk a great deal about Lake Okeechobee and the problems it faces because of excess phosphorus in the watershed. So, carbon cycle, photosynthesis and cellular respiration, drive it. Nitrogen cycle. Organisms are the ones capable of fixing nitrogen. They take nitrogen out of the atmosphere. Now, the atmosphere, I didn't say this earlier, and I'll say it later, but I'll say it now too. The air we breathe is 78% nitrogen gas into gas, which is inert. But the organisms take that nitrogen gas out of the atmosphere and fix it in a usable form. And then the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus really has to be removed from rock. It's often found in certain rock formations. Those phosphorus-rich rocks slowly release those phosphates to soils and water. So let's look at the carbon cycle. Let's illustrate that. Carbon cycle, CO2, carbon dioxide. Please make that association. When I say carbon dioxide and you see that CO2, those are the same things, carbon dioxide. CO2, carbon dioxide, moves between organisms and the atmosphere because of photosynthesis, plants taking it in and creating sugars, and respiration, taking sugars, breaking them down, releasing that carbon dioxide. In aquatic systems, carbon dioxide has to dissolve in water before it can be used by those primary producers. Although some carbon does move very quickly through the atmosphere, some of it gets locked up. It's not available for use for very long periods of time. Sequestered, and the term we'll use is pools or reservoirs. Basically, it's an area where that may or may not be available. Some of these pools of carbon dioxide, for example, the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, is available for use. But there are other forms, pools, reservoirs, same thing in this case, that are unavailable. They're locked up, if you will. Same is true for other nutrients. We'll talk about those in a minute. So this is going to be an image of the carbon cycle, if you will, kind of a pretty one. So let's look at volcanic activity first, right here. Carbon is coming from the destruction of vegetation. Volcanic activity produces a great deal of carbon dioxide. A lot of carbon is released from that. But so is, we also see it in the destruction of vegetation. Burning of fossil fuels, all those things release a great deal of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. In a later chapter, keep saying that, we will talk more about how much this has changed our atmosphere itself. Uptake of carbon to terrestrial primary production approximately equals what is returned to the atmosphere by respiration. Except for, and that's the natural balance, then we release a lot more. Alright. Uptake of carbon dioxide to the oceans slightly exceeds what goes into the atmosphere. Now, the oceans also contain a large pool of available carbon dioxide, probably the largest available pool of carbon dioxide. All right. Fossil fuels contain carbon fixed by primary producers millions of years ago, like that spinning oil thing. Basically, that's where we get our oil from. Carbon fixed by primary producers millions of years in the past. And then there are these things called carbonate rocks. Calcium carbonate is the same thing as limestone. Limestone is the largest pool of carbon on the planet. It is very much not available for use. So you can see the reservoirs. We have atmospheric carbon, we have, which is a short-term storage, and we have very long-term storage in carbonate rock. As I said, carbonate rock is actually considered to be calcium carbonate. Now once I get to that point, there we go, try it again. There we go, calcium carbonate, CaCO3. And actually shells are also made of calcium carbonate because there are plenty of sea creatures that will lay down a shell, protective shell, outside of them that is made of calcium carbonate. Look at the nitrogen cycle. 78% of the air we breathe is into nitrogen gas, N sub 2 if you will. Major atmospheric pool, that's most of where it is there in the air we breathe. Only organisms that fix nitrogen can take that abundant supply of nitrogen and use it to make nutrients, essentially, because N2 is not a nutrient. What these things do is, in the absence of oxygen, they will need energy, so they take that actually from the nitrogen. Nitrogen is reduced to this thing called ammonia, and ammonia is a very, very necessary and very common nutrient. Once nitrogen is fixed, once again taken from being inert into a usable form, it is then available to organisms, to plants, animals, to build things with. When an organism dies, that nitrogen is released by the fungi and the bacteria. Sometimes it's released all the way back to nitrogen gas. More often than not, it goes to ammonia or nitrate or other forms, usable forms. It can be recycled very quickly into other living matter. Nitrogen availability can limit the growth of organisms in certain conditions. So an image for the nitrogen cycle, right here. Looks very similar. Let's walk through this thing first of all. The annual amount of nitrogen fixation slightly exceeds what is removed. So there's a little bit more being fixed every year than what is unfixed, if you will, or used or decomposed. So it's about a balance. Once again, we saw the same thing with carbon dioxide in natural systems where we're not involved. When you look at other forms, we're going here. Lightning. There we go. Lightning. Lightning actually will fix nitrogen. There's a great deal of nitrogen in the atmosphere. There's also a pretty good amount of oxygen. Oxygen makes up about 21% of the air we breathe. And when you combine nitrogen and oxygen with a lot of energy, you actually fix nitrogen in the form of nitrate, which is another important nutrient. Annual nitrogen fixation, though, is about 1/7 of what is fixed by those organisms biologically. Get on point. There we go. Human activity. We have vastly increased the amount of nitrogen being fixed. We do it chemically. There's a process we'll talk about in a later assignment where we actually have doubled the amount of nitrogen being fixed by chemical means. And we use that to make fertilizers. Great deal of nitrogen in the ocean. Great deal is cycled. The largest actively cycled pool of nitrogen actually in the biosphere is not in the air. This is the nitrogen that's actually usable. It's actually in the oceans. Look at the phosphorus cycle. A little different. Global phosphorus does not include, when I say a substantial atmospheric pool, there is no gaseous form of phosphorus that's not highly toxic, if you will. So we don't really see phosphorus in the air in terms of a gas. You can see it in dust, but that's about it. The largest quantities are found in mineral deposits and in marine sediments. That's where most of it is locked up. Much of this is simply locked away in rock, not available to plants. Slowly released in natural systems, in terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems, by way of the weathering of rocks. So let's get straight to the picture here. Phosphorus cycle. You can guess that we have greatly changed how the phosphorus cycle works. First of all, we use a lot of phosphorus. Phosphorus is very often a limiting nutrient. We move phosphorus from terrestrial into freshwater ecosystems by fertilizers. So where does all that fertilizer come from? Well, a very small amount of phosphorus cycle is in the atmosphere. It's actually not gaseous. It's not like nitrogen gas or carbon dioxide. It is actually in dust. And we have more of it here in this part of the world because they mine phosphorus not too many miles away from where we are here in central Florida. So that dust gets up into the rainfall and we actually have it in our rainfall. Let's look a little bit where most of it is stored. Is in those marine sediments, and those rocks can return phosphorus back to terrestrial systems given that they're exposed to the surface or there's mining going on. We do a lot of mining. Largest pool of phosphorus is stored in marine sediments, which are locked well away from access. All right. Let's look at the nutrient cycle. Consider a single ion of phosphate, P O for -3. It's just the charge. It's the most commonly used form of phosphorus. We have to have it. It actually is what provides us with our energy. PO for -3. So this is a nice little image here. Let's walk through this thing. First of all, phosphate ion is absorbed by algae, and we call that thing at the bottom actually is a diatom. Second, the algae is eaten by that zooplankton. Talked about zooplankton earlier. They're basically herbivorous floating animals that will eat algae. Algae is eaten by a zooplankton. That's called a cladocera. And then, of course, moving up the chain here, we have the zooplankton that's eaten by that minnow right there. And you can guess what's going to happen next. The minnow is eaten by the pike, by the piscivore. And the piscivore dies and is decomposed, given that we don't catch it. We'll talk about that in a minute, too. That releases that phosphate ion back to the algae, absorbing it, repeating the cycle. That's a cycle. Let's talk a little bit about ecological pyramids. That's kind of where we're leading up to and how things flow through the environment. It was a bit spastic, wasn't it? I need to fix that. That's okay. So that's actually biomass, where they've taken and chipped wood down, and they're using that for energy. They're actually burning that in the smokestacks behind it. But it's a pyramid shape, so I thought I'd use it. Dry organic matter produced by living things is termed biomass. Little biomass, usually 5 to 20%, actually passes from one trophic level, say from plants to herbivores, passes from one trophic level to the next. This is an important concept we're about to get into. Graphic representation of ecosystems show pyramids of biomass, energy, or numbers. Pyramids have important ecological and human implications. This will be an assignment 2 eventually. Pyramid of energy flow. Usable energy decreases as you move through each succeeding trophic level. So in this case, start at the bottom of this particular thing. Transfer from one trophic level to the next assumes a loss of 90% from one trophic level to the next. 90% of that usable energy. Form of heat. Oh, I didn't roll that on down. I have no idea. Anyway, heat is the main. We saw this earlier with the simple food chain. Heat is lost at each of these stages. So let's look at 10,000 units of phytoplankton, primary producers, if you will, fixing that sunlight, using sunlight and carbon dioxide and water to make sugars. When they're consumed, they release heat, but that only supports 1,000 of these primary consumers, which are zooplankton, those cladocera in the previous image. Then those particular zooplankton, if you will, are consumed by these secondary consumers, the perch. We're moving it up a little bit, and heat is released. But notice 10,000 units of phytoplankton only support 100 units of perch. And then 100 units of perch will only support 10 human beings and release heat, loss at 90% between each of these trophic levels. So, is it as simple as this? Let's see. So we have this balance where human beings are on one side of the equation and what we eat is on the other side of the equation. So, eating lower on the food chain, eat grains instead of meat, can support a lot more people. And there are certain parts of the world where the idea of eating meat is simply anathema. Many of the residents of India do not eat meat. Partially it's religious. Partially it's that they couldn't support themselves. They wouldn't be able to feed themselves if they ate meat. On the other side, more like us, you have 20,000 calories of grains will support one cow, which supports one of us. Notice on the right-hand side, where you just eat the grains, you can feed 10 humans on that 20,000 calories. Advantages for food production, certainly in rural areas. 80 to 90% of the available energy is lost at each trophic level. Now, what's the mystery? What are we circling there? Why do we eat meat? Well, that's sort of a rhetorical question, but sort of not. Perhaps there's things in meat that we need, but do we need to eat so much meat? Debatable. This will be an assignment later on. All right, summary. First of all, Pop quiz right now. What's PAR? Surely you remember. Well, you have time to get out your notes and look back at it. No points for this pop quiz. I'm about to give the answer. Humans and nature, vital connections. We talked through that. Agriculture is one central part of human ecology. Artificial selection, another central part of human ecology. Back to those genetically modified organisms, or you remember the ones that were not quite so, I guess, technologically modified, where we went from one type of corn or type of a corn precursor to modern day corn, took millennia. Ecology is a study of natural systems. Very complex roots. Remember all the guys we talked through with that. Ecosystem function, how the flow of energy and nutrients through food webs. We're coming into the answer. What is that? Solar powered biosphere, and that solar power comes from photosynthetically active radiation. PAR. Don't forget that. Nutrient cycles, also known as biogeochemical cycles. Now, carbon. Carbon cycle we talked about. The primary storage form for carbon is in limestone. Nitrogen. The primary storage place for nitrogen is in the air, as in nitrogen gas. 78% of the air we breathe is nitrogen gas. And then phosphorus, primarily found in sedimentary rock. We talked about biomass and ecological pyramids. Here are the references for this lecture. Please look through those. You should be able to have, if you need to access them, though most of the information you have is available in the course homepage, D2L. Thank you very much.